Namaste and good evening to all. Our guests, members of the Sarabhai family, Malika Ben, Kartike Bhai, Mohal Bhai, and Shri Tridip Surud, other members of the Sarabhai family, invited guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's indeed a pleasure to welcome you on this day when we want to remember and pay tribute to our founder, Dr. Vikram Sarabhai. We are really privileged and honored to have that the family members of the Sarabhai family will be talking about him. You know, you've seen a lot of videos of the programs and all, but this is where we are going to listen to the family members. And as you are aware, this is the fourth event of the week commemorating AMA's 25th year on this campus. So this is the fourth talk, and India basically and the world know Dr. Vikram Sarabhai as a great visionary, a scientist, an institution builder, and known as the father of Indian space. However, his foresight and vision were much more wider. He foresaw the need for professional management when there was little or no management education in India. Dr. Sarabhai demonstrated in his own life his conviction that the ultimate end of all scientific endeavors was peace, prosperity, and the full release of human creative potentials. His vision of human society of the future was both wide and deep, and complemented his concept of a holistic science. He was the founder of AMA in 1956, and for 4 years he was the president, as I mentioned yesterday's event, that initially the office was at the Calico Mills, and then, AMA office at Bank of India, Badra, Navarangpura, and finally this place. So we are truly blessed, and, we are located in practically an institutional enclave right now. It's AMA, Atira, also founded by him, so we are really blessed by Atira to give a portion of their land so that AMA could, build this complex. Then, of course, we have IIM, ISRO, PRL. So it's absolutely not only Vikram Sarabhai Road, but an institutional enclave which is blessed and which is full of positive vibes. Everybody can feel it there. So we're truly blessed. Now, before Molba introduces the speakers, we'd like to welcome them with a floral welcome. Flowers, please. Yeah, I'll welcome Malika Ben first. Where's Savan? You will please welcome Kartike Bhai, and then Mohal Bhai will welcome Tridip. Mohal Bhai is in a dual role as part of the Sarabhai family as well as the member of our governing board. So I now hand it over to Mohal Bhai to introduce the speakers. Thank you. And then after the proceedings, we'll have a small Q&A session. All yours, Mohal. Yeah.
It is my great privilege to participate in this event, and I express my sincere gratitude to Ahmedabad Management Association for organizing this tribute for my late grandfather, Dr. Vikram Sarabhai, a great visionary and an institutional builder. AMA is one of the prime institutions founded by Dr. Vikram Sarabhai to promote management principles and practices. On behalf of AMA today, I'm proud to introduce the speakers today, Dr. Malika Sarabhai, my aunt, and Shri Kartikeya Sarabhai, my father, and daughter and son of Dr. Vikram Sarabhai, who will share their experiences with their father and his ideas on art, culture, science, and business in their dialogue with Professor Tridip Surud. My aunt, Dr. Malika Sarabhai, is one of India's leading choreographers and dancers with her dance academy, Darpana Academy of Performing Arts. She has been creating and performing both classical and contemporary works at Darpana, where she has been honorary director for 40 years. Dr. Sarabhai is also a writer, speaker, and filmmaker. She first came to international notice when she played the role of Draupadi in Peter Brook's The Mahabharata for 5 years, first in French and then in English, performing in various parts of the world. Always an advocate for societal education and women's empowerment, Dr. Sarabhai has used her art for social change on issues of the environment, women, communal harmony, and violence. She was honored by the Government of India with the Padma Bhushan in recognition for her invaluable contribution to the arts. In addition to dancing to change the world, Dr. Sarabhai is an alumni of IIM Ahmedabad, where she was awarded a PhD in organizational behavior and a personal full of earthly wisdom. My father, Kartikeya Vikram Sarabhai, is one of the world's leading environmental educators. He is the founder and director of Center for Environment Education, CEE. He is the managing trustee of Nehru Foundation for Development, established by his father, Dr. Vikram Sarabhai. Mr. Sarabhai is also a trustee of the Sabarmati Ashram and the chair of the Governing Council of the Earth Charter International. He served as a member of the UNESCO Reference Group for the UN Initiative for Sustainable Development, as well as chair of UNESCO's Global Action Program. Mr. Sarabhai was educated at Cambridge University, UK in physics and mathematics, and then MIT, USA in development communications. He's a Padma Shri awardee for exceptional and distinguished service in the field of environment education. Apart from this, I've had the privilege to work with him in the company Ambalal Sarabhi Enterprises, ASC, where his commitment to leadership and out-of-box thinking has successfully steered this legacy company towards recovery and growth since he took over as chairman in 1995. Professor Tridip Surud is the moderator for this event. Mr. Tridip is a writer and translator who works on the intellectual and cultural history of modern Gujarat and the Gandhian intellectual tradition. He has published 35 books in 3 languages and has been given the Sahitya Akademi Award and the inaugural Niranjan Bhagat Memorial Award for his literary work. He is professor and provost Sept University, director Lalbhai Dalpatbhai Institute of Indology, and serves as the chairman of the governing board of MICA. He works with both Kartikeya and Mallika Sarabhai as members of the board of CEE and Darpana, respectively. I now invite Professor Tridip Surud for the session introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohal. Good evening, namaste. Mohal, you did it. The curiosity was whether you'll be able to do that with a straight face, and it's worked. In 1940s, perhaps at no other time in modern Indian history, we dreamt the kind of dreams that rarely people dream. And that was a dream of freeing ourselves, not only from bondage, which is easy, not from the long colonial history, and we knew that the empire was coming to an end somehow. The 2 wars had ensured that. But the dream was much larger than that. That was freedom in the true sense. Freedom from want, from hunger, from oppression, from poverty, but not just that, but the freedom to dream, freedom to aspire, freedom to think like we had never thought before. And that process really went on into making what we call modern Ahmedabad. The great Ahmedabad experiment really began in 1940s and went on till about mid-1970s. And look at what that experiment was. The experiment was an idea and a belief that you needed to empower the young. And empowerment was not only the political empowerment, but it was of abilities, of worldviews, of capabilities. And if you did that, you would be able to pull this country out and take it in a kind of a course that very few countries outside of Europe and North America had even attempted to do. And that gave us this huge ecology of institutions. What's fascinating, and we can list all of them, and we have listed some of them. What's fascinating about it is the group of people who come together. You have the industry, you have the civil society, you have the professionals collaborating together alongside the government to create this institutional imagination. And in that, Dr. Vikram Sarabhai was the pivot. I don't wish to speak more about him because that's something that we will do with both Kartike Bhai and Mallika Ben. But what we need to understand is that imagination of Ahmedabad is unique. No other city in modern India has created this range of concerns, this range of institutions, and the ability to keep nurturing them. None of these institutions that we created in 1950s and 1960s have become moribund. They've gone through their ups and downs, but they've always had the capacity to pull themselves out of a morass if they found themselves into it, which is really the character of institutions of Ahmedabad, which is unparalleled in other institutions. There's another thing that we need to notice about it, that majority of these, with the exception of maybe one or two, were of an applied nature. That these were institutions where applied science, applied technology, or ideas of management which could actually help us in a very practical way to deal with the problems. So these are problem-solving institutions. No other city in modern India has so many problem-solving institutions. And I think that's the range that we wish to speak about today. Before we do get into the conversation, we have a very rare film, which is 17-minute film. I was told by Kartike Bhai and Mallika Ben while we were chatting that this has really not been seen in public in Ahmedabad as much. It was through the efforts of their mother, Mrinalini Sarabhai, that the film was obtained. She wrote to Dr. Sarabhai's counterpart in France at the Atomic Energy Commission in France, and it's through that the film was obtained. It's been slightly edited and made into 17 minutes. The French bits have been taken out. And both of them told me that this is really, it's not about Dr. Sarabhai, the institution builder, which there is, but it's the person. It's the person who comes alive through that footage. And so let's, for 17 minutes, watch it, and that will give us a springboard for a conversation. Thank you.
So, Dr. Sarabhai, this is your Earth station in Ahmedabad for satellite.
Yes, we set this up because about 5 years ago we realized that this was going to be one of the most important peaceful applications of outer space and would have a profound influence on future development of communications and mass communication in this country.
Communication and mass communication,
That's
that
right.
means telephone and television.
Yes, very much so. That was a tragic story because by the time the station was put up, there was a failure of that particular satellite with which we are going to make certain tests abroad. We did have television transmissions to Japan, for instance, and Australia, and made some test transmissions. But the major test of this will only come when we do our experiment with NASA in 1974.
74.
Yeah. You know that we are going to have for the first time the experiment to have direct broadcast of television from satellites which can beam high power to a restricted region in the territory of India.
This is a model of the receiving village antenna.
Yes, you see that it looks quite flimsy, but that doesn't prevent it from performing very beautifully. In this case, because the frequency at which you're doing the direct broadcast is only about 860 megacycles, the accuracy of this can be much less. Yes, this is a chicken mesh. The accuracy can be much less than in that antenna, where you're working with 6,000 megacycles.
And you have here a device to...
Yes, there'll be a central feed situation. And now, since we are having a synchronous satellite, this will not have to move in the same way as that big antenna has to move.
Of course.
And we think this should work out very well, very cheap. Oh, about $50, $60. And with that type of an antenna, with a normal television receiver set, you could have communities receiving in almost every village of India. And this is a very exciting possibility. One of the things we have to be careful about is not to build up a monolithic social system, because the technological system is a global one,
yes,
or a national one.
Yes.
Because without the local element in it and the local participation, the social impact will certainly be very much restricted. And that is the reason for these large number of earth stations.
You think that television is a very important thing for this country to be done?
Well, I think it's a great miscalculation that is made by people in research and development to think only in terms of financial inputs or technological inputs, particularly in a country like India, where the large mass of people who have to be motivated are illiterate. It is very important to, I think, have the information input as an integral part of the developmental process. And I think a powerful technique like an audiovisual presentation through television can be one of the most important motivations, a catalyst for action. The credibility that you are a part of a wider national scene, a wider international scene, is really dependent on your ability to make this an audiovisual experience of each individual. And I think, to my mind, one of the most important fallouts would be in relation to improving the quality of life in our rural habitations. You know, India has 500,000 villages. And if we want to really create the counter forces to urbanization, which everybody agrees has its own great problems, if we want to see that some of our best people continue and can have a meaningful, qualitatively rich experience, even if they are in villages, then we can use these new techniques to bridge that information gap, that contact with the wider sphere in the world. Oh yes. Last year, we started the Tarapur Atomic Power Plant, which is 400 megawatts of power. It is only about 200 miles from here. It's a very interesting thing that before this atomic power station came along, the two states of Maharashtra and Gujarat were each having their own grid systems. But the fact that you put up one station which was so large as to need the cooperation of a regional grid was the occasion of the joining together of these two power systems. And for the first time, one could think in terms of a major power system which goes across political frontiers of states.
Fundamental research costs a lot of money. You said a few minutes ago that atomic research was not at all a luxury, but let us speak now of fundamental research. You are, for instance, here making studies on radio astronomy, or you are going to build a cyclotron in Calcutta, which is known in the world to have a lot of fundamental needs. Is it not really a luxury to have such a fundamental research?
I don't think so, but I'll tell you why. For the simple reason that it is necessary when we come to applications to understand the reasons why certain things happen. It is the training of the fundamental scientist which helps him to make these type of evaluations. You know very well, for instance, that during the last war, it was necessary to bring in the so-called eggheads, to do operations research, to assist the generals in understanding what type of strategic decision making would be most effective. Now, these people didn't know anything of military warfare, but nevertheless, their power of analysis or the understanding of the scientific method proved very crucial. You might be interested that we are putting up this variable energy cyclotron in Calcutta. And just now, for instance, Calcutta has got a lot of terrorist movement, which is...
You mean the Naxalites?
The Naxalites, yes. Now, we were very amused when the other day we saw a board on the site of our variable energy cyclotron, ostensibly by the Naxalites, which said that this was a protected installation which should not be attacked by the Naxalites. So that you see, when you really come to a meaningful application of science and technology, I think there is a very widespread recognition in this country which goes beyond political parties or others, who recognize this as the only means for really establishing a national identity and national development. So my own feeling is, and this is how I see it, that the real advanced technology is providing a new freedom which can permit things to be done without these monolithic systems, but without also the economic penalty. For instance, it is well known that very large computers are expensive, but they are necessary for quantitative decision making in a diverse fields, whether it's business, industry, or government, or anything else, or banking. Now, in the past, when you did not have a good communication system, you would have to cluster all these institutions around this computer. But if you had a high-capacity computer and a high-capacity telecommunication system through a satellite,
With terminals,
you could provide independent access to these large facilities without having to bring them all together. Now, it is this type of solution which the truly advanced technologies provide, which will put, I think, a damper on this whole problem of urbanization. Because in the past it has not been possible to maintain a quality of life unless you brought everything together.
are you going to put a computer terminal in each Indian village?
Well, I would think that this would certainly be one way of doing it. For instance,
For administration or...
well, a good example is the meteorological one. You know, the meteorological services in this country should really be serving the farmer, who is dependent so much on agricultural, which is based on rain. But the fact that in the past, the only organized user group were the civil aviation people means that about 70 to 80% of our meteorological services are preempted by civil aviation rather than feeding the agriculturists. Now, if you had a television terminal and a data retrieval terminal in each village, you could broadcast or telecast information which is useful to the farmer, which will be understood even by the illiterate farmer. Now, it seems to me that through this advanced technology, we will be providing a new freedom and a new capability to the farmer, and making it possible in these villages to lead a type of life which today people can only do by coming together in almost obnoxious large conglomerations of population.
It is to say that freedom and life in local communities can coexist with advanced technology.
Well, I think it is essential, because this is what we must try to do. That if this solution to a particular problem requires advanced technology, I think we should not go back because it's advanced. And I think what we would like to see in this country is that many prototypes, which may not be tried in the developed countries because they have an existing infrastructure, could be meaningfully evaluated in terms of our own conditions where we don't have this, and make that an advantage rather than a handicap.
When did it start, this sort of mining?
Well, I think I think the origins of the Swadeshi movement went back even to the days when we were fighting for our independence from British rule. As you know, Mr. Gandhi was great to, was emphasizing at all stages the need not to depend on the importation of things from Great Britain. And this was a political tool. But it also...
It started as a political tool.
I think so. And it was also, it had many other economic implications too. But it was a extremely important element in the building up of a national identity. And this aspect of being able to depend on one's own resources was an important characteristic of post-war India. It finds expression in the policy of non-alignment, for instance.
And you have known this place since your childhood?
Yes, because my parents and my aunt were very closely associated with Mahatma Gandhi ever since he came back from Africa. And since early 20s, there has been a very close association of the families, my family with the national movement.
Ici, à l'heure de la prière, le Mahatma parlait à ses disciples d'une Inde différente. Il disait « India of my dreams », l'Inde de mes rêves.
Motilal Nehru, Jawaharlal Nehru, Sarojini Naidu, and all the so-called traitorous rebels of the British Raj used to come here for the political meetings. It was a very inspiring thing because Gandhi's prayer meetings used to start with recitation of Bhagavad Gita, chanted in beautiful Sanskrit. And this made a very deep impression on me. He used to use these prayer meetings to propagate his thinking.
And after that, you were yourself involved in the Gandhi movement?
No, I was never in myself involved in the political movement because I was a young student. My family was, my mother was in prison, my sister was several times in prison. And one of the early memories was that when these, my mother and my sister were tried by the British, and they would put them in prison, but they would also find them. And early one morning, the police would come and confiscate our car or something because my father would not pay the fine. And so these are the sort of memories which we had. But I myself was never in the political movement.
Yes. But you had the occasion to meet him many times.
Mr. Gandhi?
Yes.
Oh, yes. In the 40s. And, I was a graduate student then. I met him and had a long discussion once, I remember, on the question of how to solve the communal problem.
The communal problem?
Yeah. I was very deeply touched by his great courtesy to what was an immature youth who was, but he never made me feel that I was talking nonsense. He treated me with respect and listened to me and told me, spend time with me.
You're a vegetarian?
Very much so.
Very much?
Yes.
Strict vegetarian?
Well, I take eggs.
You take
But
eggs.
all my life I've been a vegetarian.
All your life? Why?
But to me it's a very...
Does this question make any sense? Why?
Yes, of course. To me it's a question of aesthetics. I am not moralistic about the situation. My wife, who incidentally comes from South India, and she comes from a Brahmin family, which is traditionally vegetarians, but she is not. She was educated abroad.
She's not?
No. She was educated in Switzerland, and just in her family, she was not brought up as a vegetarian. But I am a vegetarian, and my children are vegetarians. And this is by choice. We are not religious at all in any real sense because...
But could you explain this word, aesthetic?
Aesthetic is that it's it's repugnant to kill. The idea of killing for pleasure or for food or for satisfaction or gratification is truly repugnant. I am sure that if there was a need in a certain situation, for instance, if one is ill and one is prescribed something which has a non-vegetarian content as a medicine, that's a different matter. Please go on.
What a treat. Absolutely. And thank you very much to both of you for making this possible. One had never seen him so up close and candid in that way. And relaxed, absolutely. And you know, Kartikeya bhai, there's one question that's asked, and he very deftly moved away. He says, where did this all begin? And then he does not take credit for anything, and he says Swadeshi. But there was a beginning in which was perceived as what they, I think, very falsely called the home school, which was actually not a home school. We know it was school at home. But you want, and you've thought about that and what it meant, not just for him but for his siblings. So do you want to start sharing something about that school at retreat and what it did for him and the others?
Thanks, Rizip. It was a very moving film. And even though I have seen it earlier, to see him up close and on so many issues, and issues which are so critical to him, and how contemporary it sounds. It could have been a discussion which we are having now, not so many years ago, on those same issues of things. But where it started, you was right, that Ambalal and Sarla Devi, they had 8 children. In those days, that was a norm or accepted size of a family. And they had gone to England because Ambalal at that young age was in charge of Calico and wanted to find out the latest technologies from Lancaster and others and what they were doing. And they put their first 2 children who were born at that time to a school in London, only to find they had English governesses and everything else. Only to find that they were teased there for being dark, having habits which were different from others, and they decided not to go there.
And children were being children, so just
and
plain
children were
nasty.
being children. So they first got a tutor, and he went with them also to England. But then they started thinking about it, and I think my grandmother especially thought a lot about it. And in coming in that ship, she read in a book review in the London supplement of a book by a woman who not so well known at that time called Madame Montessori. And she got curious about this because the whole approach is a child-centric approach, and which struck a chord in Sarla Devi especially, and both of them, that each child should grow to their own potential, that you are not putting them into some sort of what shall I say, straitjacket or a die, so they come out the way the school wants you to come out. They should come out, and she used to use the word, we are like a gardener, I suppose not like a Miyake gardener, but like a regular gardener who lets that tree come out and see its full potential. So she saw that, and then got a course. She took the course in London herself, the Madame Montessori course, got in touch with them, got a teacher from them who came here, but decided that they wanted a school. So in the retreat compound, in one of the early buildings, they started the school. And it was, as Tridip rightly said, not homeschooling, which was a regular school. Over those years, we have had 60 teachers who came, and there were teachers from different things. Montessori was one, but then the whole influence of Tagore, and all the art teachers came from Shantiniketan, and all of them learned things, including the Upanishads and the Gita. They had this English teacher who said he cannot separate teaching Christianity from teaching this, and they
Yes.
finally had to let
Yeah.
him go.
Yeah.
And he goes, but all his letters are available. But in that process, Vikram's desire for doing science or doing things with his hands. There's that wonderful photo at the Community Science Center of the first train they built, which goes around the whole retreat compound.
Yeah.
And working with mechanics, not only with people who are called teachers, but they had very good. Dr. Badami was there, and people who were wonderful science teachers. Ravi Shankar Rahul was the arts teacher. So this is the way they grew up. And in fact, there was at that time a certain amount of resentment in Ahmedabad, because a few other families said, can we also put our children into that school? And Ambalal Bhai says no. And there was this whole discussion that are the Sarabhais typically being snobbish,
But,
not allowing others.
When you're doing an akhatro, right?
That's what he said.
Exactly.
He said that it is an akhatro, it's an experiment. I don't know, and I just can't take the responsibility that I give to other children, that their children, suppose they go through this school and something turns up which is really not what you want, then he said he didn't want to do it. But that was very formative for Vikram, that he had a space to do this. And in fact, much later, as you know, he said that I want every child in Ahmedabad to have that same benefit, even though they don't have Ambalal Sarabhai as their father, and which was the origin of Community Science Center. That here is an institution where anyone can walk in. And it's interesting that he mentions that story about the Naxalites.
Yes, I mean, I think...
Just one sentence on that.
Yeah.
That when the Navnirman agitation happened here, and Community Science Center has only glass all around it, they did not break a single window pane at the Community Science Center. Everywhere, Gujarat University, this, that, everywhere they were breaking it. And they answered that same thing which he says, which is that,
absolutely.
We can walk in here.
Yeah.
And Mukesh Bhai is not here, but he was part of that whole movement. But they left this thing alone.
Yeah. Malika Bhai, I'm going to, I'm not going to be chronological. At one level, I wish that we knew actually much more about his Cambridge years, because that's really one thing that we don't have much research on, or there's not much record. But that's not what I want to talk about. That last snippet, where he talks about aesthetics as a governing principle of life, and in his response to the question on food preferences, vegetarianism, it's an astounding response at one level, and at another level not so. I mean, having been around Gandhi, having been around the people that he was, but also I think the fact that one saw beauty or one sought harmony with not only oneself but one's surroundings, one's nature, is so fundamental to what he was trying to tell us. And you think about aesthetics as a central principle of your life. Do you want to reflect on what's happening there, and how do you see it? How do you respond to it now?
I think the need for everything to be harmonious, and that as beauty, was instilled very early in them. And I think Amma brought it forth. But I remember growing up in Shreyas, and I was talking to him a little while ago, saying that in Shreyas, we were given that same feeling that if you offer a flower, let it be the flower at its best. Or to think of the simplest thing as an act of reverence to the world.
Yep.
And when we were talking of the Japan Center in Japan, I think that whole country is like that. And I think in everything Papa did, there was this deep search for beauty as harmony and harmony as beauty. And it came out in lots of things, in small things, in big things. And for instance, Amma, who was also very aware of it, I remember when Kartikeya and I were growing up, and I still chide the home about it, Amma would say that the meal had to contain colors that reflected each other. So there had to be something that was red, and there had to be something that was green, and there had to be something that was white. And of course it had to be nutritious, but it also had to be beautiful. And Papa would relish that. He may not talk about it, but he would relish that so that if it didn't happen, he would notice it.
Yeah.
And I think it's that same thing he's talking about.
Yeah. And also at science, at the level at which he thought about it, is an act of beauty, right? And so I think that's profound what was happening there. And I think about there's another thing that he says in that film, and which is to say, which is the basis of decision making, because the question that's asked to him, how do you do this? Right? And his response is through research. It is the research that I do, and I think as a scientist, and so everything that I do is based upon a notion of inquiry, an objective inquiry, looking at the data, and that data tells me the kind of decisions that we need to make. We are not making here decisions based on pure sentiment. Right? Now, how crucial is that to the way he thought, functioned, created institutions, ran business, and managed affairs?
Well, as he saw research as not only for what we normally call science, but for everything, that it was data driven. And in fact, where we are sitting now, Atira came up like that when the minute he got involved with textiles, he said that let us have a research facility. And I remember research facility not just in things, but also to do with research on human behavior. And I remember seeing the first treadmill that I had ever seen in Atira here. I went into this room and there was this man perspiring away in an extremely humid room running on a treadmill. I'd never seen a treadmill before. And that was in Atira here. And they were just seeing that in a loom shed, what type of temperature would get you to best results in pharmaceuticals. Sarabhai Chemicals was coming up, and it was becoming, and it became soon the number one pharma company in India. But he put research into it, even in marketing. I remember when he talks about Operation Research here, but he started the ORG, the Operation Research Group, and they were doing research, I remember, which said that if you go into a doctor's chamber and you talk about one medicine and come out, or if you go in and talk about 2 and come out, and 3 and come out, where does the effectiveness die? And that's when they came out that 2 to 3 maximum, and maybe the third one actually when you are getting up and going, you remind the third one. And that became the norm of the pharma industry, how detailing was done. So even there, and then he found that the research was not necessarily appreciated by Sarabhai Chemicals alone. They didn't want to pay the full...
So I want you to pause there, because I think this is crucial. What we know from ORG story is that it became something that the other so-called competitors would trust them with their own research. They would provide data, and there was never a hesitation that this is a Sarabhai company and therefore our data will go to the competitor. Now, what is that notion of integrity that we're talking about? Because a general sense is that you can have ethics in private life, you can aspire to have ethics in public life, but integrity and ethics in very competitive business environment is not something that we think of as a valid proposition.
So you're right that when ORG, Sarabhai Chemicals was no longer the management, meaning it was under him, but was no longer trying to say that we will fund this whole bill. He said, I'm going to go out and offer it. And Pfizer and Glaxo, these were all the sort of competitors. And they trusted it enough because they would share all their marketing data to these people who are their competitors, and ORG would not pass a single word of it to Sarabhai Chemicals. Now, that type of faith and integrity which you felt, that was that reputation. And he imbibed it, and imbibed it right down. But it also came, I suppose, from his father and everything else. Once coming back from Bombay, in the Gujarat Mail, I had a carton given by my cousin, and I was stopped by this man. And he said, Amashuche. He was, I don't know, excise or something. I'm very sorry, I don't know. It's given by my cousin who is an artist, and so he's probably got brushes and this and that. But he asked my name. The minute he heard that name, he said, I want to tell you something. That when I was a kid, when I started the service, the first person was Ambalal Sarabhai, who would come back every Thursday from Bombay. I was supposed to be here. He would hand over a typed list of all the things he bought in Bombay, including a toothbrush. And I kept on telling him, you don't have to be so
detailed about it.
And honest about it. And I was supposed to calculate what he had to pay. His secretary would come at 11 o'clock and write a check for that amount. And so, as his grandson, I should let you go because I think that, but it was an incredible story when I just met this man at the station.
Yeah.
But that type of ethic, I mean, once I think from his window, I'm talking about my grandfather, but where Papa probably also got it, he saw that peon of Calico wiping his car, which was a private car. So he got disturbed with it and found out how much the time was and said, I have to pay for it.
Yeah.
But it was a very different time.
Yeah.
Today we don't even think of such an ethic. But that was the type of ethics which he did. But what was so nice about it, that with those ethics, you could still become number one.
Yeah.
That was, I mean, so you had to work harder, but it was not therefore that you had an excuse for failing. It was to say and believe that with ethics, with belief in people, that you can run a very successful model, and that model also runs through science and data, and therefore succeeds.
Yeah.
And the sort of systems he created, but relatively little is known about his whole, I mean, hopefully sometime someone will write about it, but what he did in the business world and how he did that, and partnerships. But again, partnerships was a fantastic part of that thing. Yeah. But I don't think he differentiated between working in business or government or something else. They were all ultimately nation-building activities.
Yes, yeah, and I think that's the vision. But you know, Malika,
before you ask me, I'd like to add to that, which is that when Papa and Amma got married and then they went away to Cambridge and then they settled down, and Papa knew that Amma was going to be, or was a professional dancer, he flew to London to learn lighting and came back with the 3 first lights of that kind to be used on stage in India. And then he lit Amma's productions for many years after that. And talking of aesthetic again, Amma used to tell me a story about how she would always show a new production to Papa and ask him for his opinion. And they'd apparently worked on a production just before going off on tour to the United States. And Amma had worked very hard, and they'd been working for 6 or 8 months. And she showed it at our theatre on the riverside to Papa, and Papa just said, and Amma said there was no way I could question that, because I knew that his taste and his integrity in saying not good enough is something that I had to believe.
I'll come to taste in a minute, right? What I wanted to ask you was, a part of the segment there is something which is very close to what you've done and what Kartikeya has done in a different way, but which is to really think of communication as an empowerment. It's an exercise not in pedagogy, it's actually an exercise of freedom, for development, for change, for even progress, and he says it's only through that we would have a country which is not monstrous, cities which are, very Gandhian, the way he thought of the relationship between the city, the village, and the knowledge there. But your own work in communication and development and what he was trying to do, do you want to reflect on that? And
yeah, my dreams of using the arts to change attitudes, to change development paradigms, was born on Papa's lap. I remember very clearly when the first televisions came in, going into the villages with him, and hearing him talk about how this could transform an entire village where a teacher would not reach for the next 50 years. And all the time that I was growing up, I was thinking of how to do it. My first experiments were working with Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation in 1980 to create 1-minute films to educate people on using garbage cans, not spitting on the roads. And I remember, I mean, I knew nothing about cinema at that time, except being an actress. But I remember doing those. And then so many years later, in 2000, when I was offered to be the CEO of the Tara channel, which was a channel, funny enough, started by Ratikant Basu, who was the collector of Peej and Kheda when the experiment was done. And that was when that idea was put into his head. So after becoming head of Doordarshan, after becoming the launching person for Star Television, he finally decided to do what Papa wanted to do, which is start television communication channels aimed at using the arts, theater, soap operas, everything, to talk about change, to talk about rights, to talk about duties, to talk about education. And in those 2 years, I was able to live Papa's dream. And then in subsequent years, we did many, many projects with Doordarshan Gujarat, primarily seeing how the most popular forms of television could be used to talk about empowerment, education, health, nutrition, violence, all of those things.
And let me just stop you there, because in continuation of what you're saying, the Vikram Sarabhai Arts Festival, which is dedicated to non-violence, right? What is, I mean, it's a very specific kind of worldview that's being... Because Amma and you...
I have always felt that the best way to get through the walls that we create around ourselves to protect us, to say, na ana vishe મને બધી ખબર છે, મારે સાંભળવાની જરૂર નથી, is not to lecture, not to give them something to read, not to make them listen and sit in a discussion, but to go through the arts. Because through the arts you can slip in and touch a soul and touch a mind where nothing else will. Because when you go to see something that's entertaining and fun or spectacular, your walls are not up.
Yeah.
And the whole Festival of Non-Violence through the Arts was started about this. When so much communal violence had just happened in Gujarat.
Yeah.
And we invited artists from across the world, and performing artists, visual artists, filmmakers, to say, would you like to come and engage with the public in talking about issues that people prefer not to talk about, which is peace, harmony. If you go and lecture about non-violence, people are going to fall asleep. But if you see a spectacular performance or a spectacular film about it, it's going to hook you somewhere.
Yeah.
And I think in my own way also, I'm fairly Gandhian in fundamental thoughts.
Yeah. I had decided not to ask personal questions, but there are two which I can't resist. One is for you, and we've spoken about it, and the other is something that you told me. But I think people have a right to know very little, but it reveals a great deal. He was the person who was the foodie in the family, right? It was, but he had also a strategy how to minimize the effort. And you want to share as to what he used to do with when he came to MIT while you were there, and invite 7 people for 7 lunches, but...
Well, this was when he was teaching at MIT, much earlier than when I went. But he used to like to entertain. And there would be, there used to be one mushroom dish, and there was one rice, and there was one this. There was a sort of set menu. And the next day we would be having the leftovers of that. But the third day there would be another group of coming in, because this menu had become so standardized and so successful that it would again be the same thing. So you would see that. But in those days, mushrooms were quite rare, and it was a treat to get a mushroom. So he, at the table, if there was little, he would tease and say, "Mananati Bautu," because he wanted you to have it.
Yeah.
And one knew what you were saying, but that type of tease, he loved to cook. And I think he loved to experiment and something which many of us have got from him and learning from that. But
you're the only one I know who can cut a piece of cake 4 ways in equal parts, right? A triangular. So I get it. I've seen you do that with great dexterity.
I have to tell the other part of this story, which was that when I was 5, Amma and Dr. Minnal Mahadevia, who used to be one of Amma's top dancers, and she was also a scientist, and very often when Amma traveled with both of us, Minnal would come with us, because then Amma could give lecture demonstrations and performances. And Papa was teaching at MIT, and again, Papa would entertain all the time, and so tortillas would be brought in. And there would be piles of tortillas, and then again like this, Papa would decide to call 5 sets of friends in 5 days, and Minnal would be making this batakanu shaak, farai batakanu shaak, and Amma didn't cook. I don't cook. It's the men who cook.
Yes.
But the other side of that story is that Papa was always very careful of not putting on weight. And I had this habit as a very young child of leaving my favorite bit of the food on the side to eat at the end. And we would be talking and eating and so on. Papa would get up to wash his hands, and next thing I knew, it was gone. Because Papa would have picked it up. And then he wouldn't count it as his calories, he would count it as Malika's calories.
Of course. Yeah. But the question that I came to ask you many years ago was about his footwear. And I'd seen all these images of him, exceptionally elegant man, going around in Kolhapuri chapels. And then you had a story, and Kartikeya Bhai also had a response to Mohal the other day, which was, I think, very, very nice, about comfort. So you start, and then just that bit, right?
Yeah, Kolhapuris used to be much more comfortable 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago than they are today. And they used to be made in a manner that you wet them and you let them dry with your feet inside them. And then they would take on your very specific foot, and you personalize them like that. They were also aesthetically very beautiful, and Papa was very interested in handmade things. And these are one of the many ways in which Papa and Amma's artistic tastes converged. And they were made incredibly intricately. And I think comfort is the third one. But he didn't want to impress anybody with the way he dressed or anything. Papa's nicer shirts were always chosen by Amma, who would go and buy green shot silk to match with his green eyes. But otherwise, Papa would have probably been in white with a nice bandi.
Yeah.
But I think this was part of that wanting to be comfortable and not wanting anything else. You have another story?
No.
No, I think your response to Mohal was that you want something immediately comfortable. You don't want comfort to grow.
But Malika, whatever you say, I have had blisters because of Kolhapuri the first 2-3 days.
No, but you do you
I didn't know this painting techniques, but I used to wear Kolhapuris.
I have to tell you that because Kartikeya and I are 5.5 years apart in age, he has a very different experience of our parents, and I have a very different experience of our parents. And I remember a lot of things that he has absolutely no inclination to remember. And he knows a lot of things. You don't remember, you know, because you spent so many more years with him. You know a lot of things that I'm only privy to secondhand, either from him or from Bhabhi or earlier from Amma.
Last set of questions, and one little story and then 2 questions. He's talking about Gandhi and how in 1940s he engaged as a very young person with Gandhi to solve the communal problem. Some years ago, I was in the archives in the Nehru Memorial, and I come across this letter from Dr. Sarabhai to MKG, and which says, Bapu, a બધું બરાબર છે, પણ અમેરિકાની અંદર ગેલપ નામની કંપની છે અને ગેલપ પોલ કરે. And that provides you scientific data as to what communities think, what people think, and if partition is inevitable, as you seem to be suggesting, why don't we get a Gallup poll done? And of course, MKG responds, and that letter we have, which is I think 27th November 1944, Atul Bhai, it's there. Beautiful response to this, but it's about that data, that relationship, asking questions. Finally, he left very early. Right? There's been speculation about the cause of death. I don't want to speculate, but I think let's put it out, because popular culture has its own imagination and ways of looking at it. So would want to reflect on that. And two, on the implications of what that passing meant. Because I remember in 1995, I was 24, 25, talking to Dr. Yashpal, and I asked him, Gujarat will never have an IT industry, right? And he looked at me and he says, Vikram Bhai died too early. That was his response.
Well, him dying at an age which was only 52, I suppose Mole's age was soon not so far away from that, and all these achievements, much younger than what we are today. And it was quite incredible how that whole thing happened, but it was so sudden because there was no illness. He, as most people know, worked till late at night. I ran into a person at a wedding in Ahmedabad, and he comes to me and says, I was a policeman in Kerala, and I was the first person to enter that room when I was called. So I said, forget the wedding, let's go and sit somewhere else and just tell me. And I just recorded that whole conversation and what happened and things. And I think my grandmother, I think Amma was too devastated to say anything, but my grandmother, I think, phoned Indiraji, the Prime Minister, to say that I don't want you to cut him up and mess it up. So the postmortem was not done. And if it was done, whether anything would be found or not, we don't know. It was a period of tension, a lot of tension. The war with Pakistan was there. India was preparing whether to make the nuclear choice or not the choice. There were lots of things about space and others. There were other sort of tensions in his mind. So it is something which is a mystery we will not really know. Maybe at some stage one would know it. I think Christina wrote to the member of the Senate in the US asking for the CIA files. And they are supposed to give it after this many years, but they can blank out what they feel is confidential. And other than the the's and the A's, everything was blacked out. So what it was, when that will be known, it is difficult to say. And there is pointless exercise to speculate because there is no way you can verify it. Yeah. So I've just let it rest at that. I mean, the fact that he went with such a trailing base at the height of what he was doing, and it was not only a personal loss, it was a loss to so much, but what was so amazing was to find that his family was really so large, that so many people he had touched, including here at AMA and others, who had a relationship with him. And that heritage of his, we happen to be the biological children and things, but it is not confined to that. There are so many people who have seen him, and in the institutions which he was, the culture which lives in each of these institutions. It is amazing that after so many years, you will find that way of taking decisions. Something new comes up every time. IIM was telling me the other day of what attitude they take if a person who is left and gone and then wants to rejoin. And I was told from them the story of what Vikram Bhai said at that time and how that is still the philosophy today. You know, it was a very simple act. That how do you treat that? And I think that's so amazing. The fact that those few seconds when he was with you, he was really with you. And I think that mindfulness and everything else. And I think so at a personal level, obviously there was a huge loss for everyone. And even now when something is achieved, one almost feels, can I pick up the phone and I tell him that? So,
You've also felt that loss viscerally, and you continue to do so, right? And
Yeah,
don't push you to talk about it.
No, but when somebody as vibrant as Papa is just extinguished like that, there is no closure ever.
Yeah.
And I also think that as a nation, we might have steered a different path had Papa been around for the next 20 years or something. Because I think both Homi Bhabha and Papa came from families where they didn't need to go into government.
Yeah.
And the faith that the government put in their integrity is something that has not quite been repeated since. And I think the nation suffered because of that.
Oh,
the
yeah.
family, of course, suffered.
Yeah, and I think that's why I think Professor Yashpal's saying, because we never took certain kinds of pathways intellectually, and right? I need to open it up to people. एक प्रश्न नहीं पूछवानो, Rocket Boys नो, बाकी बद्दू पूछाए. Sorry. No, I think what we will do is take some questions. We will try and keep it to what we've said and what we've seen, and not let our imagination run too wild. Hi, Shailendra.
Thank you. Very, very moving. One quick observation and one question. The observation is to your last point, that when he was with somebody, he was totally with that person. I remember when I first came to IIM Ahmedabad, this is now 2006, I was having my lunch in the dining room, and I happened to speak to the Safai person. And he told me, I don't know what the context was, we started talking about Vikram Sarabhai, and he said, जब वो मुझसे ऐसे बात करते थे तो वैसे ही बात करते थे जैसे किसी बड़े साहब से बात करते थे. And Professor Pisharoti put this very nicely. He said in Kerala there is the version of the Bhagavatam which is called Nilayam. And there is a shlok in Sanskrit there which says that every gopi thought that Krishna was hers and hers alone. And he said that Vikram Sarabhai had that quality. So that's the observation. The question, and by the way, the sweeper felt that. I thought that was extraordinary. The question, you talked about Malika ji, you talked about you are the biological inheritors. People leave three things behind, right? They leave behind their children, they leave behind books, and the one thing that we didn't talk about, they leave behind institutions, of which AMA is of course one. And he built one institution a year for 2 decades almost, something like that. And the extraordinary thing about institution building was his choice of people to lead them. So I'd like you to talk about that aspect, because he was an extraordinary connoisseur of men or women. I mean, in the sense that he chose leaders, he built leaders, men and women, and that was extraordinary about him. So would you like to comment on that?
Thank you for sharing that story. It's true that he had a knack of knowing a person and knowing the potential of a person. And there are so many cases when people have said that, how did you know of this person's potential at that age, when later? And that includes someone like Kalam, for instance, who's gone on to be the president, but has said it so many times that Vikram Sarabhai not only saw what I was capable of, something which even he might not have seen, but he was working on this third stage rocket. And the first and second were not there. And he said in any other organization, people would have said, you focus on the first one, first stage. But he said that because you are onto, your thinking is on the third stage, you focus on that. And if we can't get the first and second done in India, we'll fly it for somewhere else. And in fact, just after his death, it was flown from France, that third stage. But he did build up that third stage. So he got people to grow to that potential. And it goes back to maybe some things which he did in his childhood of growing people, the whole philosophy. I remember when, because you just said that when Ravi Mathai first came to Ahmedabad, and he had arrived at our home Chidambaram at I think 3 in the afternoon, and I was the only person at home, and I didn't know who this person was, and Papa had said that I'll see you for an interview at 7 o'clock in the evening. So he had literally nothing to do, no one to know, and I had that first afternoon, and I was still in Shreyas and planning Anand Melo with games on it. It was an African theme. So there was a rhinoceros and you were supposed to throw. And I got Ravi to play with me and test out every one of them. So Ravi was just saying how Papa went there and found him and then came. And the confidence with which people could work with him and with trust was quite extraordinary. And this was true in the business. It was true with young people to see, but it was also to see how people got motivated to give their best. You create an institution where people feel ownership and feel that they can contribute, and what can they contribute. And I think to some extent that brought out the best potential in that person. So one was of course the selection of the person, but the second one was enabling that person to come to what that person's true potential was and sort of unleashing that. I thought that.
Good evening. My name is Janak Nanavati, and I would like to make one small comment about what my father used to say about Vikram Bhai. He was fairly close to your father. And my father used to tell me that Dr. Sarabhai would go by train and he would give dictation on the train from here to Anand, and that fellow would get out at Anand and come back. Well, I don't know how far that was relevant or not. And the second thing is about VSSE. I mean, we talk about institutions, and I'm sure a lot of people must have seen VSSE. I've seen VSSE many, many times, and I wanted to know how he could perceive of this kind of an institution of what VSSE is today and what it was 20, 30 years ago. And he might have talked to you about VSSE. That's what we would like to know.
Sorry, I just answered.
These are questions you can answer, I can't.
Yes. No, so after the Sputnik, America felt that their science education had failed. And how can the Russians come out with the first Sputnik? So there was a lot of interest in the top scientists getting involved in science education at the school level. And for the physics, the PSSC program was headquartered at MIT, where he was teaching. So he saw that as a great potential of getting scientists involved in school education. So he came back, and at PRL, in that last room in the old building, the last floor, we had a group. It was called GISE, Group for the Improvement of Science Education. And Dr. K.B. Shah had joined him at that time. And I remember in the class was Abhijit Sen and Minal and Amla and others. We were about 5 or 6 of us in a small room doing experiments with the ripple tank, something I've tried with my grandchildren. We were doing this ripple tank experiments, and he would walk in and find out. But then from there, immediately it said that let me institutionalize this because it's working. And that came to the Community Science Center. And then, of course, after his death, it was called the Vikram Sarabhai Community Science Center. But it was also coming out of the fact that he had the benefit of his father of creating a lab for him. And he wanted that to be this. So there are two sort of streams there. One was this thing of what he saw was happening around the world, of getting some of the best scientists in the world to talk about teaching very, very primary education skills. And that train story is true. I've heard another one of someone.
Yeah, we know
Absolutely
the
true.
education, his PhD students. So there would be one who got in Ahmedabad, got off at Vadodara. There would be another one waiting in Vadodara, got off in Surat. And it was like that those were the 2 hours that they could get solo with Papa.
Yeah. And at that time, you couldn't carry out corrections. I remember he was giving a very important speech in Delhi, and I happened to be staying there that night. And Mr. Iyengar, who was the secretary and things, or Warrior, it must have been, was typing, but this next draft had to be retyped. There was no scratch. I mean, we just take it for granted that we can now make few changes and get another fresh copy. And how much, I remember the year after he passed away, at the Harvard Cooperative Society, there was this fantastic new machine, which was a handheld 4-function calculator with one memory. And it was fascinating. I remember trying to buy it, but it was too expensive. It was $180 for a 4-function thing. Next year, my mother got me one, made by brother. And I used to take it out in a plane ride and put it on my desk and pretend to do some calculation. It was so great to have that. But the fact was that all this time, when he was alive and doing things, the calculator didn't exist, let alone the cell phone and other things. So much of what we take for granted today was still not there, but it didn't deter the type of phenomenal institutional growth and the type of the computers used to be whole rooms, as you know. The first one at 1401 at Calico and one 360 at Baroda. They were roomfuls. But that whole drive of applying science to everything in a sense, and the faith of that was incredible.
Time for
One more.
Good evening. Myself Shanbag, I am a retired government officer. I was going today for the whole day, the life of Dr. Vikram Bhai, the great Vikram Bhai Sarabhai. Dr. Abdul Kalam, our former, His Excellency the President, he told once that when I had no degrees, I am to have specific related to rocket field. But Dr. Vikram Sarabhai gave me the responsibility at that time, and he stood by my difficulties at very difficult time also. He wrote many places for Dr. Vikram Sarabhai. I would like to mention here for the public. Dr. Vikram Sarabhai was founder of ISRO, IIM Ahmedabad, Atira, Community Science Center Ahmedabad, PRL, various space programs for India, rocket launching first in India, Chairman Atomic Energy Commission. Which of the contribution you feel is worth mentioning, if one is to be mentioned? And the second is, both of you, brother, sister, which memory you share till today also, specific to be mentioned with your father?
Well, the first thing, if you ask any of my children, they will say that try and get Papa to say one, which is the top thing.
I think both of us are the same.
He'll think in multidimensional ways. So not in a linear way where this is number one and this is number two, because each of the institutions were unique, but at the same time there is a thread which runs through all of them. That it is important really for us who are interested in reading about Dr. Sarabhai to find out what is the common thread which goes through his business, Atira, IIM, AMA, PRL, Community Science Center, and what. And it is, you can put some words there. It is empowering people. It's applying science to decision making. It is having integrity. It is a strong sense of nationalism, but nationalism which means that you could collaborate with the world. it is not an isolationist nationalism. That was a very important thing.
And to do that as an equal. I mean, to have the confidence
do
to
it
do
like
that
an
as an
equal.
equal.
But nationalism meant the betterment of the last person. Nationalism didn't meant GDP or industrial growth or anything like that. So all his institutions were to try and improve life for the weakest link in the country.
Yeah. But again, when I said in the beginning that it was still very much in business, I was telling Mohal that he would tell his sales force that last year's budget has to be completed by Diwali. I mean, that was his thing. So you have to complete, like that is the growth rate you have to go. So he still drove an extremely powerful things in spite of, with all the values in it, and saw it as the way of national building. So he saw in this context of AMA today that industrial or institutional or government, these are all ways in which a nation gets built. And how do you do it with that integrity? And there are many stories about that. Today we didn't really go into the institutional thing, which was relatively more known, seeing him as a person. But there are books about it and others, and one should refer to it. And many other stories on cultural harmony, for instance. There are extraordinary stories of that rocket. Abdul Kalam again mentioned that very much, that they found that the magnetic equator went through this beach in Trivandrum, and what better building than a church to build a rocket? You know, where do you get that long hall? And it's easy to say, let the government pass an order and take it away. But he didn't do that. He went there, talked to the father there, and the father said, even I'm not going to take a decision. You have to ask my parish. And he goes there, on a Sunday morning, I think, and he talks to all of them. And he says, this is a national thing, and it's an extraordinary request. Would you people be willing to give up your church? Give up your church for a national cause. I want to build a rocket here. Now, just think. And they all raise their hand and say, Amen. You know, I mean, the trust you put in. Suppose they had said no, what would you have done? Because that was one of the only places you could do it. But the fact that he shared that with people, and Abdul Kalam mentions this as this extraordinary way in which India needs to think, not of taking people away, but being inclusive. And when you are inclusive, people are willing to give. People are willing to give. And that's an example. I mean, how many places can you go to and say, can you give up your temple or your hall or your this auditorium, for instance? Someone comes and says, I want this for this. I mean, it would be extremely difficult decision, but it was done. And no question of force, no question of this. Let them take the decision. So I think there's some extraordinary qualities, lot about his life. Obviously, in an hour and a half, you can't.
I think that's a great point to pause at and conclude the evening. So thank you very much. Thank you, AMA. But the two of you, thank you very much. I mean, this was to include me in this conversation was very special. Thank you. Thank you both.
Yeah. Professor Surud, I must thank you, and I'll maybe take this opportunity to do the honors of thanking. Such a fabulous, and thanks again, Professor, for conducting it so well. There's so much that we're taking home, and it's not the treat that we had in the film of this 17 minutes. And the treat, so much of emotions, so much of, I would say goosebumps that we are having, maybe just short of tears at sometimes after the conversation, that what the man has given us and how much can we be indebted to him, that we can be not just as our city, but as a country also, and the institutions that he has built. So certainly, of course, as Karthikeya rightly said, that this must be 50, 60 years, right? And we talk about, if we can relate it to contemporary, we talk about, problem of urbanization. Imagine in that the gentleman is talking about, and talking about farmer upliftment, which is the story now happening in this country that people are talking about. And of course, I have known Karthikeya for so many years, and such a respect, what he's doing, what cause he's imbibed as a family. Mallika Ben, I'm so impressed when I met her one-to-one at her institution. The cause, she wants to do some. So the family and that I'm seeing in the fortunately, of late Mohalbai also, that it is all about the purpose, and purpose is, as Malika Ben said, nation building. Everything is purpose is that what can we do for things at large. And certainly Professor Surut sir will say that yes, there would be a mystery of how he left us, but he has certainly not left us. He is absolutely immortal. He will always be there for all of us for all the life. Thank you on behalf of AMA. I'm thanking you. Thanks so much. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thanks.